Just abnormal. Hey. All right. She had some surgery when she was a baby.
You got the medications, the medications.
A 3-month-old baby is saved from absolutely deplorable conditions. However, her life will still never be the same. Now, years later, the girl's mom is behind bars after the baby was found unresponsive and covered in bruises. Thanks for joining us on Law and Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner. The baby's mom claimed that her dog jumped on her daughter and that's why she had visible bruises on her body. The woman's boyfriend told police that the 3-month-old might have been bitten, but according to police, it wasn't either of those things that caused that little baby to be unresponsive.
Where's the baby?
This was the moment officers found a 3-month-old girl unresponsive in her home, and they quickly handed her over to rescue crews.
Oh, all those bees. What's that, man? The airways aren't plugged. It's breathing on you, just abnormal. Hey. All right. She had some surgery when she was a baby.
You got the medications, the medications.
On November 8th of 2023, the 3-month-old baby was rushed to the hospital. Earlier that morning, her family said she wouldn't wake up. She was reportedly unresponsive, limp, and lethargic. Thankfully, she was still alive, though, but something was off. The baby had noticeable bruises on her little stomach. When they asked the baby's mother, Kelly Ward, what happened, the 22-year-old claimed a dog jumped on her daughter. But when officers were inside the home, they reportedly described what can only be seen as horrible and unsanitary conditions to live in, especially for a 3-month-old baby. Inside the home, DeLand police described seeing spiders, and what comes with spiders, cobwebs, which reportedly covered the corners of the ceiling. They noticed roaches crawling over the walls. Kelly's boyfriend even allegedly told officers he thought the bruises on Kelly's baby may have come from rats in the house. Kelly's boyfriend is not the father of her baby, but he and Kelly were allegedly the last 2 adults seen with the baby. The next morning they woke up, the little girl was reportedly experiencing seizures, and then she became unresponsive. According to reports, it's unclear the full extent of what happened that night before Kelly's daughter was found. But doctors claim what happened to her baby wasn't natural at all. Not from a dog, not from rats, but her injuries were consistent with shaken baby syndrome. According to a report by WESH, Kelly's baby has permanent brain damage. She now has to be on a feeding tube. It's possible she'll be unable to see, walk, talk, or perform basic daily functions for the rest of her life. Now, I mentioned just a bit ago, officers responded in November of 2023. It's obviously now 2025, and earlier this month, Kelly was officially charged with neglect of a child causing great bodily harm. She was booked into jail on August 4th, and less than a week later, on August 9th, she was released on a $5,000 cash bond. It's been reported that Kelly's boyfriend might face charges too. However, as of this recording, jail records at the Volusia County Jail don't reflect he's been arrested or even charged, which is why we aren't saying the man's name. It's unclear why the charges came nearly 2 years after Kelly's baby was found unresponsive, but we might learn more details soon. Kelly is expected to be back in court later this month. I'm joined now by criminal defense attorney Florina Altschiller. Florina, thank you so much for joining me today. You know, right off the bat, I want to ask you, why do you think that these felony charges came nearly 2 years after Kelly Ward's daughter was found unresponsive and injured?
Medically, it's very complicated, and in order to be able to establish any sort of intentional criminal act, they would need to be able to establish causation. The charges here are not an intentional crime, it's just negligence, which is a much easier, lower standard. And my best guess as to why it took 2 years is I'm thinking they were looking at intentional, higher level criminal charges against her, but needed the medical proof to support that. I suspect the medical proof simply is not there because the question of causation is a complicated question that's not always easily answered, especially when there could be multiple reasons for the injuries being there.
And, you know, right now, too, it's unclear if Kelly's boyfriend will be charged with anything, but he was one of the last people seen with the baby girl in addition to Kelly Ward. But he's not the child's father. But why do you think that he wasn't charged or faced any type of charges? Is it because he's not the girl's biological father and the responsibility doesn't really fall with him? What are your thoughts on that aspect?
That's exactly correct, Elizabeth. For the negligence charges, the parent has a duty to be responsible for their child. A boyfriend who's not the sole caretaker and is not the biological parent really doesn't have that duty. The only way he would have that duty is if she left the child alone with the boyfriend and trusted the boyfriend to be responsible for the child. In that situation, even a babysitter, not a boyfriend or relative, but just a babysitter, could potentially be negligent too when they have the sole responsibility for the care of that child for the period of time when the injuries occur. Those are not the facts here. So she, as the parent, could be criminally negligent because she has a duty to care for this child, and the very occurrence of the injuries and death very well could have been from her negligence. That's much easier to establish than she intentionally caused those injuries or she intentionally, worse, caused the death. That's really difficult to establish, especially absent medical proof to support that.
And that makes a lot of sense because, we cover a number of child abuse cases, just horrific cases too, where you see instances where the babysitter is charged, and that makes a lot of sense given that the parents aren't at the home, so I can completely understand that. And, just reading through the baby's injuries, they were just hard to read through. Doctors confirming that Kelly's baby's injuries weren't natural, they were consistent with shaken baby syndrome. What's your reaction to that, and how often have you seen those types of cases?
Shaken baby syndrome is a science and not a science. It's not the science of shaken baby syndrome is really questionable. There's experts who disagree. It's very difficult to establish. It is the primary cause of criminal charges against parents when there's a death of a child, but many times the medical evidence and other discovery reveals that there's potential other contributing factors or causes to the death of a child that are not shaken baby syndrome.
And how tough is it to investigate and even prosecute these types of cases where there are kind of medical issues? For example, Kelly's baby now reportedly has brain damage. She's on a feeding tube and she might not be able to perform her basic daily functions, because we do have to remember that she is still alive in this case. And now that we're nearly 2 years after authorities were called, she's probably about 2 years old, I would say. But in terms of just the damages that happened to her in result of allegedly the shaken baby syndrome, how difficult is it to prosecute a case like this?
Right, so she was 3 months old at the time, obviously nonverbal, which is normal for a 3-month-old. So the baby and now 2-year-old can't tell us what happened. If there's no eyewitnesses, it's really the mother's word if she made any statements about what happened, as compared to what the science shows, what is documented in terms of injuries, what marks there are on the child, what the scans reveal in terms of the brain damage, and what alternative other causes may exist to explain the injuries that are present. And shaken baby syndrome is something that could occur when a child sustains essentially a traumatic brain injury like a concussion. That could be from a parent intentionally shaking the child. It could be from the child falling. It could be from the child hitting their head. Now, there you would expect to see some external marks on the head if there was trauma to the head. When there's no trauma to the outside, but you only have injuries to the brain on the inside, that suggests obviously no contact and no fall. Again, the more that the mother said, the more the medicine and science can dispute what she says. And if we think she's lying, that's more reason to charge her criminally. The less she says, the less there is to dispute. And now we really just don't know how this could have happened.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I believe initially she had told police that a dog jumped on her baby, which she was saying that was the explanation for the injuries and the bruises that were on her stomach. But police also mentioned that the house was in deplorable conditions. I mean, there were spiders, there were spider webs, there were roaches, and I mean, that's not the type of environment anyone should be living in, let alone a 3-month-old little girl. But even the boyfriend told police that there were rats around the house and that she might have been bitten by a rat. But what does that tell you about the condition of which the girl was living in?
Right, and that's clearly negligence in terms of the condition of the home and in proper parenting and keeping a child safe. We're not talking about a home that maybe isn't super well maintained. We're talking about a home that's not hygienic and likely not a home appropriate for a 3-month-old to live in if it's infested, as is alleged. What's interesting there, though, is if the boyfriend is saying, well, this may have been caused by rats, and the mother is saying, well, a dog jumped on it, it's a question of what did each observe and when are they saying this happened, and do the statements contradict each other? Was the boyfriend there when this dog supposedly jumped on the child's stomach? Why isn't the boyfriend reporting that? Or are they talking about two separate instances? Maybe at one time the boyfriend saw rats, at another time the mother says a dog jumped on the child. Both could have happened at different times. It's really not clear. So there's a lot of questions of what was observed, what makes sense, what's reasonable, and it sounds like the child's injuries are much worse than what both the mother and the boyfriend are saying they observed. And there's not really a clear explanation as to how it could have happened. I suspect that it took 2 years to really fully investigate this and to try to get answers to these unanswered questions. I don't know that they're there yet either. I think that there may be more serious charges depending on what happens with this now 2-year-old child, the seriousness of the injuries, and whatever else they could discover. I mean, a lot of times the parent, if they did something criminal, speaks. They speak to friends, they speak to family members, and eventually they inadvertently say something that contradicts what they said much earlier on. And if people come forward and let law enforcement know what those statements are that they're making, sometimes that helps with the investigation. So it's not even just the parent saying, oh, yes, I shook her and that's how it happened. The parent might just say, oh, there was a cat involved and the cat scratched her. But previously, 2 years earlier, they said a dog jumped on her.
Right.
And while you might not think that a cat scratching her is significant, it is when it contradicts an earlier statement.
Right. And despite, what a lot of TV shows make you feel, investigations aren't solved that quickly overnight in 30 minutes, 44 minutes, whatever it may be. And I think, when this case came out, a lot of people, especially on social media, had a lot of thoughts on this, and that they were very surprised that Kelly's bond amount was just $5,000. I mean, $5,000. It seems like a low amount given the allegations, but what are your thoughts on just the bond amount given that she's already been released from jail?
Right. Well, you have to consider not what the facts are in terms of the injuries to the child, which are horrific, but what the charge is. And negligence is a pretty low charge that carries with it not that significant a prison sentence. And so the bond reflects two things. It reflects whether or not she's a flight risk. So is there any reason to believe that she's going to run away and never come back to court? And if she's a lifelong resident in the community, if she has a job, if she has ties to the community, there's no reason to believe she's going to flee. Her bond will be low, or sometimes people are just released on their own recognizance. The other thing that they look at is the seriousness of the charges. So when someone is charged with homicide and they're looking at 20 to life as a prison sentence, there's the belief that they're more likely a flight risk because they're looking at a really significant prison sentence. When someone's looking at up to a year in jail, they're considered to be a lower flight risk because they're not going to flee the country because they're looking at being incarcerated for less than a year.
Right.
I'm not saying that's right, but that's the general way that courts look at it. So between considering whether she's a flight risk because she does or does not have ties to the community and considering the seriousness of the charges, and here it's a negligence charge, which is not as serious as it could be compared to what she could have been charged with, the bond's appropriate.
Yeah. Especially because it could have been a lot worse. And thankfully, her daughter, again, is still alive. But I'm curious to know, Florina, too, as far as, if she were to be convicted on this charge and she is still reportedly maybe her daughter's primary caregiver, from what we know now, I mean, nothing's been mentioned so far about the girl's father. But does that change anything in terms of if she is incarcerated or if she is convicted of this and, the daughter is left without a caregiver? How will that affect things?
Right. So two separate court systems in play. The family court system would decide what parental rights she may or may not lose in terms of, whether she still has custody, whether she has visitation, if it has to be supervised visitation. The criminal system does not determine her parental rights. It just determines whether she's going to be incarcerated if she's found guilty of criminal charges. Now, if she is found guilty of criminal charges related to this child, there would be an order of protection issued in the criminal court for the benefit of the child, which means she can't have contact with the child. And that's something that obviously a family court would also consider in either terminating her parental rights or limiting her parental rights. Most likely, the child would be given to a relative. Sometimes it's the other parent, sometimes it's a grandparent, whatever responsible adult relative that's closest related to the child is available. And then she may or may not have visitation, which may or may not be supervised, depending on ultimately what a family court decides with regard to her parental rights. And that's only if she's convicted of the criminal charges. If she's not convicted of the criminal charges, there can still be a separate family court proceeding. But then in family court, they would have to prove that negligence to a lower and different standard than in criminal court. And depending on what happens there, that can still affect her parental rights.
And that makes a lot of sense, and we'll see how this continues to play out. She hasn't entered a plea yet. She'll be arraigned later this month, but we'll see again and follow this case very closely. Florina, I want to thank you so much for your time and your insight into this case. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Kelly Ward hasn't entered a plea yet to her charge. She's expected to be arraigned on August 28th. Thanks so much for joining us here on Law and Crime. I'm Elizabeth Millner.